Hello, everyone. Welcome to Washington Walks Webinar Wednesdays. I'm Carolyn Crouch, and I'm the founder of Washington Walks, which is a DC-based walking tour company here in the District of Columbia. This is our second to the last of our online offerings for the spring and early summer. We're going to be taking a break in most of July. We'll have one more webinar next week with my colleague Garrett Peck, who will be talking about the first brewer in the nation's capital, except that he was brewing beer in what today we know as Old Town Alexandria. So how does he get to be in the nation's capital? And what was his beer like? That's next week. Then we're going to take a break for the rest of July, and we'll be back in August through the end of the calendar year with more online offerings and experiences for you. We have really enjoyed doing these webinars, and we've really enjoyed interactions that we've had with you all through the Q&A function. Feel free to use that for today's webinar, which is called Race Riot in Washington, July 1919. And to talk about that, this incident, this chapter in DC history that probably is not familiar to a lot of you who are listening, we have today Chris Myers Asch, who is with us from Augusta, Maine area. Although Chris, you are a DC born Mainer. And maybe you don't really consider yourself, actually, I used to go on vacation in Maine, and I happen to know that you are not a Mainer. You are not, you don't really have much of a chance of probably ever being accepted as being a Mainer. So just wear that District of Columbia identity proudly. Where were you born in DC?
So I actually was not born, my dad was in the Foreign Service, so I was born in Bangkok, but we came back when I was 2. And so, I went to Lafayette, Deal, Wilson, so the stepping stones through DC public schools. And my mom still lives up in Chevy Chase in the house I grew up in.
Oh, how nice. How nice. Well, your reason I reached out to you, Chris, is because in 2017, you and a colleague, friend, Derek Musgrove, published a book. And I'm going to hold the book up. It's called Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital. And for someone who does what I do for a living, which is tell stories about Washington, D.C. and share the stories of D.C. neighborhoods with people, this book is invaluable. And it's a gift that will keep on giving as long as I'm doing what I'm doing. And even if you're not a tour guide or a historian, if you are a citizen of Washington, D.C. or the metro area, and you just want to know more about, well, what was happening when? Chocolate City is your book. If you just kind of come across an article in the Washington Post, you think, well, what was happening in DC back in, let's say, 1919? You go to Chocolate City because it takes us from the beginning of the city's history to, how far did we get? I can't remember, Chris. How far did you and Derek go?
The mayoral election of 2010.
Right.
And then shortly thereafter, the first census figures come out showing that there's no longer a Black majority in DC. And we use that as kind of the ending point.
Very good. Well, thank you again for that project. How long did it take you guys to write the book?
So Derek and I, start to finish, about 6 years. We were mostly done after about 5, but the editing and publication process took a little while. So 5 solid years, and I moved. Both of us had a bunch of children in the meantime, so life interfered with with the book. But it's a big project. It ended up being a lot longer than we had anticipated, or that our editor at the press had anticipated. But we felt like it was a story that needed to be told, and we wanted to do it justice. So it is a little bit on the longer side, but I hope it's worth it. And it's really, for you and for all those folks that you mentioned, the folks who are here on this webinar, as you said, I mean, that's really who we wrote it for, is for people who either are from the city, or people just visiting the city, or who are just moved to the city and don't really know much about the city's history, and just want one book where they can read it start to finish and have a really good sense of why the city is the way it is.
And I mean, I would love to talk about the book this whole time, but I'm going to add one more thing, or amplify what you're saying. In my opinion, except for a book that used to be used, or perhaps still is used, in DC public school curriculum, City of Magnificent Intentions, we were without a comprehensive history of our city until your book was published. There was not kind of the one volume that you could go to that would sort of tell you the story. So for that alone, accolades and gratitude. Well, so this moment in Washington history, this is 100 years ago, about, and I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to put up a different image. 100 years ago, in 1919, Washington and the country has come out of World War I. And I wanted to show this image of the District of Columbia War Memorial on the National Mall. Wasn't erected in 1919. This is not erected until 1931. This memorial is the only one on the National Mall that is local to DC. It's right now the only World War I memorial that is visible in the city. And it lists the names alphabetically of all the District of Columbia residents who lost their lives in the war, regardless of their race or their class or their gender. So this is very egalitarian in feel, and very kind of humble and elegant. So you could go to this memorial and hear a tour guide interpret it for you and say to yourself, what a lovely city, grassroots effort to raise money to make this memorial where everyone is included. Beautiful, and it is beautiful. But back in 1919, there was a bit of a different story that was not one that was about people feeling egalitarian, or social systems or cities being particularly egalitarian. It was what's come to be known as the Red Summer in the United States. So I found this map that shows race riots and lynchings that occurred between April and November 1919. We're on that map, Chris.
Definitely. So I'm happy to start telling the story of DC in 1919, a century ago. And so the way I'd like to do is just talk for a little while. I know it's hard on Zoom. I feel like people don't like to listen to lectures in general, but especially not over the computer. So I'll talk for a while, but I'm very interested in people's questions. So what particular things that they want to talk about. Particularly right now, it's interesting because we're at a time where it's a crazy world where tear gas and fires and heavily armed police are regularly seen on the streets of the nation's capital again. So we're going to talk about a time when that happened before. Not just 1968, which many people know about, but in the aftermath of World War I. So to set the context, before 1919, I think it's important to talk about the war itself, World War I. Of course, Woodrow Wilson. I went to Wilson High School. A lot of folks are trying to get the name of that high school changed because of his negative record in terms of the city of DC. But Woodrow Wilson was a man of great ideals, especially on the international stage. And when he went to war, it wasn't just a war for national interest. It was a war for democracy. It was a war for freedom. It was a war for self-determination. And so the rhetoric of the war, the framing of the war is really important, because when he starts talking about getting into war, and people start mobilizing for war. In fact, Black Washingtonians are among the first soldiers mustered and mobilized for the war, even before his April 1917 declaration of war. Wilson mobilizes troops, Black Washingtonians, from the DC National Guard to protect the White House and other key sites because they were already worried about German subversion.
I find this sort of, I'm stunned a little bit here. And I'm thinking about just patriotism of DC's African American community, because they were going to then be asked to guard the house where the man lived, who had segregated the federal government and severely hampered, damaged, destroyed professional careers and livelihoods.
It's a difficult position for young African Americans, and in fact, it's quite a debate, not only in DC's African American community, but also throughout the African American community in America about whether or not Black Americans should heed this call. Right, when America calls, should Black Americans answer? I mean, after all, this is at the height of lynching. When there's lynching across the South, where there's debt peonage across the South, which is still where most African Americans live, and there was a serious question of why should we? We've seen this before, right? We fought in the Civil War, we fought in the Revolutionary War, we fought in all
right.
of it, and all these promises that are made about freedom and about democracy and about equality, none of them have come true. Why should we do this again? But pretty soon, pretty quickly after mobilization starts, African American leaders coalesce around this idea of proving their patriotism. Right, African American men are gonna wear the uniform. They're gonna strap on the guns. They're gonna go abroad. They're gonna fight in France, and they're gonna come back and they're gonna demand equality at home, and that's by and large what they do. Black soldiers across the country voluntarily register for the draft. More than 26,000 Black men from DC alone register for the draft. You have thousands upon thousands of them who serve. Frederick Douglass's son Charles organizes a regiment that fights in France, and many of the city's Black leaders have fought in the war. Men like Rayford Logan, who becomes a famous historian of Black history at Howard, and perhaps the most important civil rights leader in the city's history is Charles Hamilton Houston.
Right, yeah.
Comes back from the war embittered, and it's part of what drives him to become a civil rights attorney. So that war experience, it's a forging experience for many, particularly young men, African American men, who come back, and they come back different. Archibald Grimke, who's the head of DC's NAACP, he says, "Look, these are not the same people who left." Right? He says the Black soldier has come back not as he went, but as a new Negro. He says this in early 1919. And many different leaders are saying the same thing. In May of that year, W.E.B. Du Bois, who along with Booker T. Washington are perhaps the two most well-known Black intellectuals, he writes in the NAACP's magazine, he says, "Look, we return from fighting, we return fighting. We are coming home to fight for our rights." And they make no bones about it. Kelly Miller, who's a Howard University professor and one of the most prolific writers on race at the time, he says, "Those who fight for the honor of that flag should have the freedoms and privileges associated with that flag." And so there's very much a sense on the part of the African American community that things need to be different now. That when we come home from this, many of us died there. Many people are wounded and suffering, having fought over there. We deserve the basic elements of citizenship. And so they come back with that attitude, which is dubbed, as Archibald Grimke called it, the new Negro. And that's embraced within the Black community to say, yes, we are, you see signs today where people are saying, "Oh, we are not our ancestors." Well, that's how the new Negro, these young people of the new Negro movement felt. Later, it becomes sort of known as the Harlem Renaissance, and it's a part of this larger cultural flowering in Black America. But it really starts out as this new Negro, this idea that young Black people are not going to accept segregation and lynching and all these other things that have been going on.
There's two people that you mention in your chapter about these, or the sections about the Red Summer riots. And I just want to show the listeners and the viewers images of them a second. James Weldon Johnson is the person who gives us the term Red Summer, which until I read about him, I always assumed that Red Summer had something to do with suspicions of being a communist, that kind of a Red Scare. And in fact, Red Summer, to James Weldon Johnson, is no spilled blood of our people. Here's A. Phillip Randolph, who people know as for his career as an organizer, civil rights activist, Pullman porters.
You usually don't see pictures of A. Phillip Randolph as a young man. Most of the pictures are from later on in his life.
I went out of my way to find one of him from 1920. So this probably about what he looked like now. What role is he playing for African Americans in the country right now at this time?
So Phillip Randolph is one of the foremost civil rights leaders of the early 20th century. And he's involved in everything on up to and including the March on Washington in the 1960s. I mean, he's a socialist leader. He's a union leader. He's the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he is among the foremost advocates of Black equality. I mean, later he launches in 1941 the March on Washington movement, this idea to bring tens of thousands of Black people to the country to demand equality in the defense industry. At this time, he's a young socialist union leader, and he's active in this New Negro movement. He and Marcus Garvey, nationally, but also there's Marcus Garvey, Marcus Garvey embraces this Back to Africa movement. It's kind of like what we later in the 1960s was called the Black is Beautiful movement.
Mm-hmm.
This sense in the post-World War I era, in the 1920s, this sense of reclaiming Black pride and Black heritage, and really expressing deep pride in who Black people are and what they produced for this country. And there's this flowering of Black culture and Black literature, Black arts. For Marcus Garvey really embodied this sense of pride, this sense of Black people as something to contribute. And even though most people did not end up going back to Africa, they nonetheless saw in him, the sense of nationalist pride.
Mm-hmm.
And locally, you see this in Alain Locke, who's a professor at Howard, who puts a compilation together of essays called The New Negro. About a third of them are local Washington people, or connected to Washington, people who are writing about what this means, what it means to be Black in the 1920s. So there's a real flowering of Black culture at the time, and Randolph, Garvey, locally, folks like Archibald Grimke, they're the leaders of this movement.
Oh, here's an image too. This is William Stuart Nelson as a young soldier in World War II, and just thinking about the connection of Howard University and the general feeling of we're not the same as we were when we left. Well, he comes back and he ends up in his career becoming a dean at Howard University. So he's contributing to this kind of movement that you're describing. I love this image of African-American Navy men I guess they're off duty, playing dice or craps, but there they are. And then just, how about a point of pride for Black Washingtonians, and I hope all Washingtonians. This is February 1919. This is a welcome home parade for African Americans from DC who served, and they're being parading along Pennsylvania Avenue. And remember, this is 100 years ago, and there was a pandemic going on at that time. And look carefully at the photo, and people are wearing masks.
Not much social distancing going on, looks like.
Not much social distancing going on there. No, no, no. But anyway, I had found these photographs, and I think they just speak to what you're describing as the environment and kind of the zeitgeist for Washington's and America's Black community at the time.
Right. Well, the problem, though, is that they run into the serious problems of demobilization. If you think about any time a war ends, you know, a massive war with massive mobilization like World War I. So you have hundreds of thousands of soldiers coming home, coming out of the army. Price controls are lifted. So you see staggering levels of unemployment. There's inflation running rampant. And you know, many Black workers had come in what we know, what historians now call the first Great Migration, right? They came out of the South, they flooded into wartime industries to build the armaments while other soldiers were away. Well, when folks come back, when the soldiers come back, they want their jobs back, and there's a lot of economic tension. So there's unemployment, there's dislocation across the country, and then so you see a lot of those flare-ups, those incidents that are happening across the country. They're happening a lot of times over economic frustration. You know, white soldiers coming back, expecting to be able to get their jobs back, not finding jobs, taking it out on the Black community. And in Washington, we have that significantly. I mean, we're not an industrial city, but it happens in all the wars. I mean, Washington's population always expands during wartime with war workers and soldiers mobilizing. After the war, the population comes down a little bit, but it's still at about 450,000, which is 100,000 more than it started with.
Oh, wow.
The economy is shrinking because the wartime economy, it's moving back to peacetime. So a lot of these people, so a lot of these young men, many of whom still wear their uniforms, even though they're no longer in the military, they don't have much to do. And so there's problems with crime. A lot of these guys are out there carousing in the streets. And many of these white veterans, still in uniform, form what they call the Home Defense League.
Oh, yeah.
Mentioned the Red Scare, the scare of communists, then fears of communist subversion in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so many white soldiers formed this vigilante group, supposedly to look out for communist subversion. But what ends up happening is they go just looking to bang some heads. And the problem is, so you've got on the one hand, you've got the new Negro, you've got Black war veterans coming back with a sense that they really, having fought for freedom abroad, they're going to fight for freedom at home. Then on the other hand, you have demobilization, you have all this economic dislocation, you have white war veterans who are not at all interested in changing the racial equation. Many of them are idle, many of them are resentful, and many of them are still in uniform. And so this is it's a tinderbox, and in the other cities, it's starting to flare up. And by June, July of the summer of 1919, D.C. itself gets engulfed in violence. And what happens is there's a series of assaults on women around town, not only white women, but the media plays up these attacks on white women. They say are being perpetrated by a Black man. And so the Home Defense League and other sort of self-appointed white vigilantes start going out looking for the perpetrator. And the NAACP, which is a young organization, the DC NAACP is only about 7 years old at that point. They see what's going on, and they're nervous. They're nervous because they've seen racial conflagrations erupt in other places, particularly in East St. Louis, Missouri, during the war itself. And they know what role the media played in those previous episodes. And they actually write a letter to all four of the major white-run papers saying, look, you've got to stop with these inflammatory articles, these incendiary headlines talking about, Negro thugs and this kind of thing, preying upon white women, because they say you're sowing the seeds of a race riot.
And at this time, people won't probably, yes, there are people who are participating today who will remember when DC was more than a two newspaper town. Right now we have the Washington Post and the Washington Times, but we used to have the Washington Evening Star, and that was the paper of record until it ceased publishing. And at this time, it's actually the Washington Post that's participating, it seems, enthusiastically with this kind of whipping up people's sentiments about how salacious or violent or horrible these incidents are.
Absolutely, and the Post was the most notorious of the papers at this time. That goes all the way back to its founding in the 1870s. It was founded as a democratic, the Democratic Party back in the 1870s was the party of white supremacy, all the way for many, many, many decades, particularly in the South, and DC was part of it. Of course. And so the Post, up until the 1930s and 40s, the change leadership, is really not interested in racial equality, certainly, and is very much in support of white supremacy and protecting the segregated world that of Washington. So yes, so the Post in particular is notorious for these kinds of attention-grabbing headlines that inflame racial tensions. And it ends up exploding in the middle of July in 1919 when a young white woman is walking home from work and she gets accosted by a couple of black men. Reports differ on exactly what happened. Some say they tried to steal her umbrella. In any case, she goes home, tells her husband works for the military, and he ends up telling his friends, and they mobilize the next day. So this happens on a Friday night, and by Saturday night, there's masses. The Post estimates between 1,000, 2,000 white men, some of whom are in uniform, full military uniform, and they basically take it upon themselves to riot through the black communities of DC. And I know you have a map showing some of the different one of the areas was actually down by Nats Park, where Nats Park is now in a neighborhood.
Yeah. So this map, unfortunately, you're right. That woman who you mentioned who worked at, she worked at the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. I believe she lived in Southwest. I can't remember. She might have done. But this map is showing actually just a, here we go. The public library. This is Mount Vernon Square, where the Carnegie Library, building still is today. And so this is showing how far north flare-ups and attacks occurred on people. Just if you're not from Washington, see right here, this says this is the Treasury Department. So just to the west of that, that's Lafayette Park where the White House is. And then just below where it says Patent Office, this will be in the major downtown shopping area of Washington, D.C. at this time.
Right. So it's widespread, and it actually the day before, I believe this would have been Sunday night, but Saturday night rioting was more in the southeast section of town as well. So it spreads pretty widely. And I know one of the commenters asked about the term riot, and so that that was a term that everybody on every side used back during that time. And it also, a lot of times people say, oh, it was a race riot. Even though the rioting that was done certainly was done on one side. I mean, this was a white riot. Some people would call it, a white race riot. I mean, they were just going around smashing windows, taking people off of streetcars, beating them on the streets. Breaking into black businesses, the whole rest. And the authorities largely do nothing. I mean, the authorities essentially stand by. They're outnumbered, certainly. And they do nothing that first night, Saturday night. And the black community is appalled. They go to both local authorities and federal authorities. They go to the Secretary of Navy and say, look, these are your boys out there, right? They've got your uniform on. You need to corral them. And he basically says, no, not my job. The local authorities, the DC police, they tell the crowds to break up. The crowds don't listen. They don't do anything. There are no arrests made on Saturday night.
Well, and if I was African American, I mean, this map is significant. You would not just feel rage because of what was happening, but you would feel you were being invaded and attacked based on the circles of flare-ups and rioting on this map. Because if you know anything about DC history, you will know that up here, LaDroit Park, right here, this is a historically African-American, it became an African-American neighborhood. It's just north of where Howard University is, historically Black, nation's first historically Black college. Here is up around here, the U Street, today's U Street Historic District neighborhood, which was the heart and soul of DC's Black community. So you're being invaded. Where you live, you're being invaded.
Absolutely. And you know, what's interesting is that after that first night of rioting, no arrests are made. Black leaders appeal to the leadership of the town, the white leadership of the town, and get nowhere. The white mobs know that the authorities are on their side, and they come out in larger numbers. And so this looks like from Sunday night, where what had been more localized in Southwest, Southeast now spreads much more much northward and through, you know, some of the middle-class Black neighborhoods. And on Monday morning, the Post puts out a little notice saying that there's going to be a cleanup operation that they say is going to make the previous two nights pale in comparison. By that point, the Black leadership in town and just Black people in the community are saying, look, we can't stand by anymore, right? This is a newspaper calling on basically the white people to come and wipe out our neighborhoods. And we've seen this play out, right? We saw this in East St. Louis. We saw this happen in Houston. We saw this happening in other places. We can't let this happen here, right? Because DC is the capital, not just of America, but it's the capital of Black America.
Yes.
And what happens in DC, especially for Black people, doesn't stay in DC. It sets a precedent. And DC at this time has the nation's largest, most educated, most prosperous Black community in the country. And the Black leadership says, we just can't let our community be destroyed. And so Black veterans get together, and Monday they start gathering ammunition. The local gun stores have stopped selling weapons to Black customers. So they go to Baltimore, they go up to Baltimore, get guns, bring them down. They post snipers on rooftops. I mean, these are veterans, right? They're trained. They know what they're doing. And they start fighting back. So when night falls on Monday, it's not a one-sided show. The Black community is fighting back. The Black community is firing at the white mobs who come into their neighborhoods, and are largely successful. I mean, they are largely successful in repulsing the white invaders of their communities. In the absence of local police action, in the absence of federal protection, the Black community takes it upon itself to defend itself. At that point, now by Tuesday, the fact that you have Black people arming themselves and shooting at white people, that motivates action. That gets the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, says, okay, we've got to get involved here, or this is going to get completely out of control. We're going to have lots of people dead on both sides. And he does. He calls out the cavalry.
Okay, look, I have a photo of that. Hold on. Look. He sure did.
Cavalry dispatches hundreds of troops. He's helped by the big rainstorm Tuesday night, and they're able to restore order. President Wilson, by the way, is actually out on a cruise. He's essentially absent and irrelevant through all this.
And he's also, actually by this time he's very ill, I believe. Isn't he?
Also sick, and so it's really the Secretary of War who takes charge of the situation. He realizes that the local authorities, they start arresting folks Monday night. I think the ratio was something on the order of 10 to 1, 10 Black arrestees for every one white arrestee. And so by Tuesday night, the situation is under control. Compared to later disturbances, in '68 or now, there's really not that much property damage because the white mobs were really attacking people. They attacked individuals. And estimates range from 6 to 30 people dead. But what comes out of this that's interesting is that the Black community is very proud of what it was able to do. Very proud of itself for, there's a the Washington Bee, which was the predominant Black paper in town. And it's saying, yes, it was stopped. I mean, it was stopped primarily because of Black self-defense. And what's interesting is after the events take place, after all the violence subsides, you have all these people who have been arrested and are being charged with various crimes. And so, the Black community is full of lawyers. The Black community is full of people who work in government. The Black community is full of people who are educated and know how to work the system. And they fight back in the courts. They fight back in the media. They really fight back, not just to protect individual, to seek justice on behalf of individuals. And they're able to get a lot of cases thrown out afterwards by simply filing lawsuits or challenging the charges in court. So they're able to win on the legal front, but they're really interested in winning the narrative. They're interested, people, writers, you saw James Weldon Johnson, he's writing for the NAACP, Crisis Magazine. You have many Black writers who take to writing letters to the editor, who write in Black publications, who write for white publications, and they are determined to get the story out. They want to make sure that people understand what actually happened, because the official version was, oh, this is a race riot. Black people just went crazy. And isn't this terrible? We had to bring the guard in to get him to stop. And people blamed all sorts of things. They blamed the new Negro, right? This new spirit of militancy. They blamed black servants being uppity. This uppityness. This term. When Black people start to feel like they actually should be treated equally. But
they blame alcohol. This is Prohibition time.
They didn't blame alcohol that much, but they did. The white authorities. There's this fabulous source. During the war, there was a military intelligence division that was focused, and there was a that was focused on the Black community, because during the war there was all this concern about subversion, German subversion, and communist subversion, and they thought that the Black community was going to be particularly vulnerable. You have a picture of Major Walter Loving. He was the one Black agent who was assigned to investigate and interview Black people and to sort of figure out if they were going to be anti-war or anti the American effort or susceptible to communism, whatever. But his supervisor, Major Cutler, J.E. Cutler.
No, I don't have an image of him, unfortunately.
When he's analyzing this situation, he doesn't put any blame. All the blame is on this new Negro, right? They just aren't the same people. He says there's a new Negro to be reckoned with here. We don't know. We don't know how to deal with it. And Loving writes back, and it ends up being his final report for the service, because he leaves. He says, no, these are just people pushed to the brink who decided to fight back. And so the Black community really works hard to control the narrative of this incident, to make sure that people understood that it's these white vigilantes who were to blame, and that the violence was stopped because Black people stood up for themselves. And they do, and that's kind of a larger lesson for today's protests. I mean, this idea that oftentimes it's the battle over what gets told about an incident that's more important than the battle itself, because what we remember about an event, whether it's the Civil War. I mean, look at what we're fighting over now: is who gets remembered and why? Why are we celebrating these traitors who lost the war to destroy the Union? Well, the reason is because the white South won the battle over the narrative for a century. it won the battle over the narrative, and we're still dealing with that. And so the Black community, through the courts, through the media, works very hard to make sure that the blame gets pinned in the right places, and people understand that the authorities did not come to protect the Black community, that it was the Black community itself that had to rise up in its own self-defense.
So I just am imagining the profound impact for a young Phillip Randolph, younger Charles Hamilton Houston, anybody who was of age during this moment in Washington and America's history who is African American. I've got to think they're going to take this experience, and they're going to carry that with them as they gain in age and wisdom, so that you're Phillip Randolph and you're becoming one of the key people. He has the plans in the early 1940s for the March on Washington, but then he is one of the big architects for the March on Washington in the 1960s.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a searing incident, absolutely. And for Charles Hamilton Houston, some of the riots took place within blocks of his childhood home, and he comes away very angry through the whole experience of his experience in the war and afterwards. And that's really a burr in his saddle as he is hitching up to fight for equality, right? He remembers that very, very clearly. It's part of what motivates him 20 years later, as World War II is concluding. Many of these folks, these World War I veterans, remember what happens after the end of the war, right? And so when the war is ending in 1944-45, they are preparing again. They're like, look, we're not going to let this happen again. We need to take advantage of this opportunity to really push for Black civil rights. But absolutely, it's a searing experience. It also teaches a lesson about power, right? And who gets protected and who doesn't. Right? Here are white soldiers wearing a uniform that they should not be wearing, right? You can't just walk around when you're demobilized and you are no longer serving in the, you can't just impersonate a soldier. And yet here they are arming themselves, wearing the uniform of this country, attacking innocent civilians. And who do the police protect? They protect the rioters. They don't protect the Black community. It's a profound lesson, not one that was surprising to any Black person at the time, but just underscoring the nature of their powerlessness. They can't even be protected when they're being assaulted.
Right.
And
right.
that fuels a rage, akin to what we're seeing now, right? Because it's that same lesson, like realizing, I think seeing George Floyd on the ground in Minneapolis underscored that same lesson. It's like, look, the people who are supposed to be protecting us are killing us, right? Or are aiding the people who are killing us, or are doing nothing to stop these people from killing us. And that fuels a rage that is hard to put out.
I have not been. I'm going to see what we've got questions coming in. Yeah, someone mentions they're wearing masks. Yeah. Do we know, did Black soldiers experience high casualty rates in World War I too? I'm sure they did.
They did. And, they saw a lot of combat. And it's interesting because they wanted to see combat. And I think one of the things that comes early on is in the early training, a lot of times the Black units were being trained to basically serve white units, to be cooks and suppliers of white units. And many Black leaders are saying, no, that's not what they need to do. They want to prove their manhood. They want to fight. And so they do see relatively high casualty rates. And people come out of that war very, very proud of the experience, of the record, of the wartime record of Black soldiers. And you see this in some of the way the French community, the French people responded to African American soldiers. Yeah. Very, very grateful, very thankful for the service. And so when you saw the pictures from that parade, that's part of a larger welcome home kind of parade. And at first, Black soldiers weren't going to be included, but they fought for it. And Teddy Roosevelt, former President Teddy Roosevelt, fights for them to be included because their record was very strong. And this again was part of this larger argument to say, look, we've proven our manhood. We've proven our patriotism. We deserve equal rights. And I mean, it's the same argument that was made during the Civil War when almost 200,000 African American soldiers fight in that war, and argue afterwards that they deserve the right to vote. They deserve the right to participate equally in American democracy.
I'm thinking that, and someone has asked a question about this, that folks might be wondering about how 1919 relates to what has just been in our consciousness in the past week, and that is the riot, the attack, the invasion that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That happens in 1921. So
Right.
that's not part of the Red Summer.
It's not part of the Red Summer, but it is part of this larger post-war effort to put Black people back in their place. I think that there was a real concern, and I spent a good part of my 20s and 30s living in rural Mississippi and studying Mississippi history. And there's a real concern on the part of segregationists down south that there's this new Negro to be reckoned with. They're not going to go back to the farm like they used to. We see this in 1919. Actually, the most devastating massacre is in Elaine, Arkansas, which was plantation country, cotton country, where estimates range 200 to 300 Black workers were murdered. And that effort, and the effort in Tulsa as well, is an effort to put Black people back in their place, to help make sure that they understand that no matter how much how brave you were over in France, no matter how successful your business is, no matter how educated you think you are still a second-class citizen in this country, right? And I think the success of the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa was really an affront to white supremacy.
Yeah.
It was, and you see this over and over. There was sort of this myth that, lynching was a response to Black people preying on white women. And often, there were often stories concocted around that. But if you look at the records, a lot of times it's about Black people having economic success, right? Gaining land, opening a business, starting to act too uppity, right? Starting to assume that they have the same rights as a white person. That's what triggers a lynching. That's what triggers a white riot, going through Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Rosewood, Florida, or other places, to just wipe out an entire community, because their Black success is an affront to white supremacy, because it undermines the foundational basis of white supremacy.
So is it safe to say, on the map that we first showed at the beginning, where all these so-called riots or attacks and lynchings occurred, this was all violence instigated by whites?
Yeah, so most of the time when you hear the term race riot used, but in newspapers at the time, it's generally that way. Because you have to understand that Black people, if a group of 1,000 Black people massed to try to attack a white community, the forces from every police department in that state would be there, in minutes. They would all come together, and they would beat that mob down. The reason why these mobs succeed, it's the same reason why the lynchings are, nobody ever gets convicted of lynching, right? Is because the authorities are in on it. And if they're not in on it, they're not willing to do anything to stop it. If Black people were rampaging through white communities, you can bet that every soldier in the vicinity is going to be, every police officer, every soldier, every vigilante is going to be armed and ready to beat them back.
My colleague, Brenda Turner, who does an excellent walking tour of Arlington Cemetery about African Americans in World War I, she shares that the Black combat troops were all serving under the French. That was arranged by Black Jack Pershing, the commander of all of it, everyone who came from the United States. And some of them were known as the famous Harlem Hellfighters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she probably knows a lot more about this era, certainly, than Derek and I do.
What kind of reforms, if any, did the DC Black community seek and achieve in the aftermath of this Red Summer?
It's a great question. And so, the 1920s are largely, in terms of politics, a time of disappointment in terms of reforms, because they're not able to institutionalize a whole lot of change. The newspapers kind of walk back their coverage a bit and start to include more articles about the Black community and sort of Black gossip pages, the way they have white gossip pages. So there's some movements among middle class reformers to try to have like interracial committees and that sort of the community chest later in the 20s starts to open up and provide funding for Black organizations working in Black communities, but it's piecemeal and it's not institutionalized. What happens more hopefully is what I referred to before, is this kind of renaissance of Black culture, which we now call, and the historians call, the Harlem Renaissance, but it really has a lot of roots in as well, especially around Howard University.
Yes.
Georgia Douglas Johnson used to run these salons for Black intellectuals, and Jean Toomer is writing novels, and Elaine Locke and Rayford Logan are writing about Black literature and Black history. I mean, it's really a cultural and artistic time of flowering.
Yes. And you're reminded me, there's two books I can think of that I'll recommend to folks. If you will permit me to turn away a minute, I'll hold one up. A Literary Guide to Washington, D.C. by our colleague, poet, writer, Kim Roberts. In this book, she includes everyone who Chris has just mentioned, African-American writers and poets. And she does a wonderful job in this book of making the case through just revealing the writing and the poetry, the essay writing of the African-Americans in DC at this time. That really, what the Harlem Renaissance really does germinate here in the nation's capital. And another book I'm thinking about is by Elizabeth Dowling Taylor. Let me see, here it is. The Original Black Elite, Daniel Murray and the Story of a Forgotten Era. And this is a book all about pre-Woodrow Wilson, but certainly post-Wilson, 1920s, 1930s Washington, through the eyes of this Daniel Murray, who worked at the Library of Congress and was impacted by what President Wilson did, segregating the government. So anyway, I thought of the sidebar.
People talking about sort of the glory days of U Street and Black Broadway and those kinds, and that comes out really during this era with Duke Ellington is playing. You have jazz clubs every block, and it really is in some ways the height of Black culture and achievement within segregation in Washington.
So that leads me to ask you, and I'm going to I love this image, but I want to end with this image. That just made me think Chocolate City. We were a chocolate city. When you and Derek started to write this book, did you know that was going to be the title?
That was one of the first things we agreed on, and from the very beginning it stuck. Lots of everything else changed, but the title stuck. And so the thing about Chocolate City is it's a term that's used very affectionately in the Black community, starting in the late 60s, early 70s with Black Power.
Isn't it from Parliament Funkadelic?
Well, the Parliament's more of a reflection of it rather than the cause of it.
Okay.
They're reflecting, and so Parliament 1975 comes out with its famous Chocolate City song and album, and on the cover, and the coloring of our book is actually similar to that. It's kind of paying homage to their wonderful album cover, but it was very much an affectionate term for a Black majority city, and DC was the first major city to have a Black majority, starting in 1957, and by 1975, when Parliament comes out with this, I mean, it's widely understood as kind of the original chocolate city. And what that meant, it conjured in images of Black culture and Black pride and Black nationalism, sort of sense of, this is one piece of the rock, as they say in the song, one piece of the rock that we own, right? That we can control. Our book spans not just the 60s and 70s, of course, it goes back to the 1600s and spans 400 years of DC history. But what we argue in there is that the presence of a large and active African-American community is really, it really helps you. It's a dynamic force and animating force in DC history. And that if you don't understand race and the role that the African American played, you can't understand Washington, DC. And that influence is going to last long after whatever the percentage is now, whether it's 51% or 42% or whatever. The influence of Black culture and Black politics and the Black presence in DC is foundational to the city. And you have to understand that in order to understand the city.
I agree. And I would really recommend to everyone who you're all going to go get this book. You're going to go to your favorite independent bookstore. And if right now you want to support an independent Black bookstore and a Black owned business, get your copy from Mahogany Books in Congress Heights. But your opening chapter about the origins of the nation's capital and how race, slavery is really in our DNA, I think is everyone should read that. Everyone should sort of internalize that and kind of come to the city history through that lens, because it's sobering, but it's also really empowering, because I think that's the way to really understand how Washington has evolved and how we got to be a chocolate city and how we always are contributing to the national conversation, the national agenda.
For sure.
And I mean that as us as hometown, not us as the federal government and the administration, but us as citizenry.
Amen. I agree.
Someone asks, any plans for a sequel starting in 2011 to like 2020?
400 years? No. Not at the moment, anyway. One of the things, even writing about, say, the mayoral election in 2010, historian, you need some time to get some perspective on what's really important, to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, historically. Because a lot of what gets churned out in the daily papers ends up meaning not very much long term. And then some that get ignored at the time, later on you see them as major developments. And so you kind of need a lot of time to be able to process what's really important. And so, we are a long way from writing the history of the 2020 protests, for example, and in the sense of their long-term impact. That's why historians should refrain from weighing in too quickly on this or that issue of the day, just because it takes some time to really measure something's importance historically.
And I'll amen that. I agree. There's wisdom to be gained from waiting.
Right.
Chris, thank you so much for spending this hour in conversation. Much appreciated. Thank you again for your gift to the city. Thank you for ongoing work that you're doing as a historian up there in Maine.
Appreciate the invitation and always enjoy it. It's just a little weird because I can't see anybody, but I hope you all enjoyed it. And feel free to let me know if you have questions about Chocolate City or anything, and hope you'll enjoy the book.
Thank you. And let me just say, for those of you who weren't here at the very beginning when I made this announcement, next Wednesday is going to be our history webinar about DC's very first beer brewer, that is. My colleague Derek Peck will be with us. Then we're going to take a break for the rest of July, and we'll be back in August through the end of the calendar year with more and different online experiences. We won't totally abandon you during July. We're still going to push out great content on our social media pages, and we'll email you. And if you think, oh, shoot, I missed those webinars, Well, our great administrator, Victoria, has gotten them all up on our website so you can review and relive. But we'll see you next week. And thank you again, Chris Myers Asch.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.